So in this first lesson, we're going to install our project and have a quick walkthrough of what is inside. Any kind of JavaScript application that we may build nowadays has this package.json file, which contains all of the definitions for our dependencies and how we may run our project. This includes things such as running a start command, which is then going to run Angular serve. We also have a build command, which will then build our project for production. So these are things to keep in mind. Now, this project was created via the Angular CLI, and you can visit more on the angular.io official website and navigate across to the Angular/CLI page. This will then tell you how to globally install the CLI, the basic workflow, how to create a new project and serve a new project, and also lots of things that it does for us. Now, we don't need to worry too much about this because what I've done is taken the liberty of creating a boilerplate for us, and then I've adapted a few things. So I've added things such as a JSON server, which will then allow us to essentially mimic talking to a real-world API so that we can build out a far more realistic application. We have all the usual suspects. We have our Angular animations package, the common, compiler, and these are things that the Angular CLI generates for us. So even though we may not be using some of these, such as the animations we're not going to cover in this course, the CLI will generate all of this for us. And if we do not use it, it's absolutely fine. It doesn't get included in our code. So it's not going to bloat out our JavaScript bundles when we do come to deploying our application for the real world. We then have our Angular CLI as a development dependency and some behind the scenes compiler related code, some TypeScript types for Jasmine and Node, and then some further testing related code, and finally our TypeScript, which is what we're going to be writing our Angular applications with. So with a package.json, we need to simply get set up. For this, I'm going to use an npm install. We can then hit enter. This will then go and download all of our dependencies. We also have this lock file, which then describes the versions that we're going to use. If you do see any vulnerability warnings, these are typically packages that our CLI is using behind the scenes. So it's not something that we can fix ourselves, but as we continue, we can then update them in later versions. Once that's finished installing, we then have this node_modules, which then means we have all of our project dependencies. Now we could use the Angular CLI directly and run ng space serve. However, I'm going to run an npm start, which then runs this ng serve behind the scenes for us. So while that's compiling, we can have a quick look through the rest of our project. We have some TypeScript definitions for our testing, our application, a README. Now this proxy I've added for our local database, so we don't need to worry about that just yet. We've looked at our package.json. Our Karma is our testing file, which we'll come onto in later courses. Our db.json. Most importantly, we have this angular.json. Now this does look quite intimidating if we were to then go ahead and scroll through things. I wouldn't encourage you to jump in here and start changing lots of things, but essentially this tells the Angular CLI how and why to build our project in certain ways. So you can see that when we're building our Angular components, we have a few options selected, such as inline templates, inline styles. We're using Sass. For this, we're going to be skipping our tests, so that's going to be set as true. We are using our strict mode. There's lots of things in here, and you can have a look through them in your own time as well. This also tells us how to build our project, where to build our project in a dist directory, our entry points to our application, any assets that we do want to include. So this is all set up for you, and we don't really need to touch this ourselves. There's also some development tasks. So you can see here that we can enable the build optimizer and a few other options. And these tie directly into Webpack, which is a JavaScript bundler behind the scenes, and this is something that the Angular CLI does for us. So we don't need to worry about running our local code, compiling things, and very complex build tasks. We can simply use the Angular CLI as a perfect Google recommended approach to getting started with Angular. So with that said, we've pretty much gone through the directory of the project, and it's important to remember that these files are generated for us from the Angular CLI, which means that we have an Angular live development server that's listening on localhost 4200. If we then open this up in the browser, we then have Hello Angular. And if we open up our Chrome DevTools, we also have Hello Angular, which is coming from app.component.ts. So if we were to jump into our app, you can see that I am inside this lifecycle hook, which we'll come onto in the later chapters. We're console logging hello Angular. Now, the great thing about this is we could very quickly change this over to hello world, and you can see that very quickly this is then live, recompiled, and reloaded. We also get the added benefit of source mapping. So we can see this app.component.ts. We can then see exactly the source file that this is coming from. So it's not actually inspecting our compiled and perhaps minified code, which is then hard to debug. So the Angular CLI gives us a lot of clever technology out of the box. We get all this live reloading, build optimizations, and so much more. And we'll experiment with a few different pieces of the Angular CLI throughout the course as well, and also build our final application with it. So with that said, we are fully set up. We've had a project install, we've walked through the code base, and we understand a little bit more about a typical Angular application setup. Now in the next video, what I'm going to do is walk through the Angular modules and the components so we know how things actually bootstrap and how our Angular application springs into life. Rather than just installing it and getting on with things, I want you to fully understand some of these files. So with that in mind, let's jump into the next lesson and get started.